Our Old Testament reading is Psalm 32, verses 1 through 7. The psalmist expresses confidence in God's forgiveness and deliverance. Happy are those whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Happy are those to whom the Lord imputes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. While I kept silence, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up, as by the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let all who are faithful offer prayer to you. At a time of distress, the rush of mighty waters shall not reach them. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with glad cries of deliverance. The New Testament reading today is from 2 Corinthians 5:16 through 21. Paul writes to the Corinthians about newness and reconciliation. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. So, if anyone in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
Lucy is chasing Charlie Brown, shaking her fist at him and shouting, "I'll get you, Charlie Brown. I'll get you, and when I do, I'm going to knock your block off." Suddenly, Charlie Brown screeches to a halt and turns around and says, "Wait a minute, Lucy. You and I are relatively small children with relatively small problems, and if we can't sit down and talk through our problems with love, respect, and understanding, then how can we expect the great nations of the world to sit down and talk things through?" But then Lucy slugs him anyway. And she says, "I had to hit him quick. He was beginning to make sense." Indeed, Charlie Brown wisely understood the power of reconciliation. But Lucy was afraid it might change her ways, and she didn't really want to risk that. In today's epistle reading, as Paul writes to the Corinthians, he's beginning to make sense. I say that because of that first phrase, "From now on, therefore." It signifies that what he is about to say relates to what came before, perhaps as further explanation and to help it make better sense. Now, there are lots of therefores in this letter, but if we look back at what immediately precedes this passage, we surmise that apparently Paul has been accused of making sense sometimes, and on other occasions, acting like a lunatic. Indeed, back in verse 13, Paul confesses to madness. But he explains, if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. And if we are in our right mind, it is for you. Referring both to his devotion to God and his love for the Corinthians. It might help to place this passage in the context of the sometimes troubled relationship Paul had with the church in Corinth. As David Frederickson of Luther Seminary explains it, after Paul's first visit to Corinth, after he had written 1 Corinthians and sent it by Timothy, Paul decided to visit the church again. On this second visit, he was somehow insulted or injured by an unknown person, and the church took no action. Paul left Corinth and sent what he refers to as a letter of tears, criticizing the church for ignoring his injury. He later learned that the church had disciplined the offending individual, and that his tearful letter had caused the church considerable pain. What a mess. Everybody is upset. And to make matters worse, the super apostles show up with their letters of recommendation, impressing the Corinthians and refuting Paul's teaching. It was partially in response to this disaster of a situation that Paul's profoundly theological words on grace and forgiveness and reconciliation emerged. Paul is dismayed that the Corinthians are drawn to apostles other than him, and he desperately wants reconciliation in the community, I think both with God and with himself. In general, this passage can be taken to refer to his own conversion, as before he saw the light, as we say, he did view Christ from a human perspective. All of that, and more too, is the foundation for this therefore that begins our passage today. From now on, therefore, we regard no one as from a human point of view. Now, Paul has other standards by which to measure, as his perspective has been changed. He sees Christ in a new way, different from the way the world sees him. Before Paul's conversion, he had a harsh view of Jesus, to the point of persecuting his followers. Now he sees Jesus through the eyes of faith. And for those who say you cannot change human nature, Paul says, if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. The wording in verse 17, that everything has become new, would refer to an ongoing act of creation. Paul says that Christ restores the relationship between the Creator and creation. As part of this new creation, we have a change of heart and no longer view Christ or one another in the same way. When Paul speaks of reconciliation, it is not like two people at odds with one another learning to compromise. And it isn't like Lucy and Charlie Brown, where one person knows the other makes sense but slugs him anyway. There is an element of forgiveness in reconciliation that opens up the possibility for a new relationship. The word reconcile literally means to restore relationship. Paul says that in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. Part of that involves not counting our trespasses against us. It is that grace that allows for transformation and new creation. God's change is all-encompassing. And as recipients of this reconciliation, we are ambassadors for Christ, entrusted with the message of reconciliation, and called to reach across boundaries and barriers to share the good news. We are forgiven and reconciled and enter into a new relationship with God through Christ, that we might become the righteousness of God. Now, to be righteous doesn't mean we're perfect or that we do what is right all the time. It doesn't mean we're more holy than anyone else. It means to be put in a right relationship with God. New creation, reconciliation, ambassadors, righteousness. What does all that mean for us? When we are reconciled to God through Christ, we see each other in new ways. We learn to value the gifts and contributions of everyone. This is true both individually and as a church. Our welcoming process has helped us move past labels and prejudices and see everyone as children of God and brothers and sisters in Christ. We also see our neighbors outside of these walls in new ways, not according to wealth, strength, influence, or status, but with charity. And that has even bridged denominational lines. Over the past 20 years, we have seen increased cooperation with our neighbors on both sides. Here we sit between the Baptists and the Catholics. And although there are issues on which we will never agree, we have been able to work together through Center City Christian Outreach, through the Council of Churches, through Faith Voices, to address poverty and injustice and food insecurity in our community, right here in our neighborhood. Each year, we teach our baptism class that the decision to follow Jesus means making a change in our values, in the way we think and behave. It is a lifetime journey, and sometimes we fail, all of us. But we claim that promise that if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. But sometimes change comes slowly. You've probably heard the old joke, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one. But the light bulb has to really want to change. It's the same for us. To become new creations, we have to want to change and work on that change every day. If we are to grow, we have to be willing to let go of habits that hinder our ability to change. This season of Lent calls us to open ourselves to new possibilities and new creation. And Paul reminds us that all this is from God. We are not asked to do things on our own or through our own abilities. God calls us simply to be willing to step out on the journey where new creation opens up the possibility for ministries of reconciliation. Ministries through which others experience the transforming love of God. It is a Lenten journey worth taking. In the movie The Truman Show, several years ago, the main character, Truman Burbank, unbeknownst to himself, lives in a controlled environment. His every move broadcast to the outside world. When he discovers there is a whole new world beyond his existence, even a world with uncertainties and risks, he has no desire to go back to his former life. Before Paul's conversion, all he knew was how things were in his old world. After his encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road, Paul could not go back to his former life. As a recipient of God's act of reconciliation, Paul commits to being an ambassador for Christ in the new age. As recipients of God's grace, the Corinthians are called to share the good news of reconciliation, and so are we. We can see glimpses of God's new creation in the struggling church at Corinth. And if we look around us, we can see them in our own struggles here at South Street Christian Church. Now it's beginning to make sense. And that is good news indeed. Amen.